rare situation is allowing you to buy some ETF stocks for 50% off. Learn more at crushthestreet.com/profit2017.
Hello everyone and welcome into crushthestreet.com. I'm Kenneth Emery and I'm joined today with a special guest, Richard Chapo. He's a lawyer with 24 years plus of experience, well known in the internet business world, based out of Southern California. His philosophy is to proactively position his clients to minimize their potential exposure to lawsuits. And hey, no one wants to get sued, so you might as well be proactive and make sure you are taking steps to protect yourself. His website, if you want to reach out and learn more about him, is SoCalInternetLawyer.com. We're going to have a great discussion today. Richard, thanks for coming on the line with me.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Richard, I remember being in college, just starting in 2006, and I took a business law class. And the teacher was talking about all the unprecedented changes the internet was bringing around. And this was, mind you, 11 years ago. And I remember the example was, what if you bought a product in Nevada? It's shipped from Colorado, but the company is based in Florida. Where do you settle the lawsuit? And these are the things that they had to start answering. You know, questions that were never issues in the past because the technology was so far behind. So I just, by way of getting to know you, what you're doing, tell us, where we are right now in terms of the internet and legal matters pertaining to it with your experience.
Sure. I think with the web, when the web first became a commercial property, right around 1999, 2000, when we really started seeing it become viable. The cliche at that time was the internet was very much the wild, wild west because there were very few laws, much as the professor was stating. And in 1998, at that time we had President Clinton, and there was a big push to create a national, you might call it a web of laws that would help support the internet as a commercial medium. And so you had laws passed such as the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that dealt with copyright. You had the Communications Decency Act, which ironically was a law designed to try to curtail online porn. It actually got overturned by the Supreme Court. But a section of it called Section 230 established that defamation issues where people were saying nasty things about each other, that websites could not be held liable for that. And that section survived the Supreme Court ruling. So you had a bunch of laws that were passed in this area that really helped the internet grow, helped companies like Facebook and what have you come on. Because if you think about copyright, for instance, if the DMCA didn't exist, and a lot of people don't like the law, but if it didn't exist, companies like Twitter and Facebook probably would have ended up in bankruptcy court under a pile of copyright infringement lawsuits when they started. So for about 10 years there, it was pretty free flowing, and you had, as your professor mentioned, a lot of issues that just weren't settled. And at that point, you would really have liked to have seen the federal government come in and issued more laws that address some of these things. Where would lawsuits be heard? If there were these issues or that. And as you probably noticed, our political climate since 2000 has been slightly unpleasant. And so there have been very few federal laws passed on a lot of these issues. So instead, what has happened is states and courts have stepped in and started issuing their own laws and judicial decisions, regarding those laws. And the interesting thing that you're seeing now, not only in the U.S. but worldwide, is whereas in 2000 it was the wild, wild west, now you're seeing the pendulum swing back, and not only back, but instead of stopping, at a middle reasonable point, it's really going, almost to a position where we have excessive regulation and excessive laws. The other thing that you're seeing is governments. We always think about the World Wide Web. Well, governments are now partitioning the web, and they're passing laws and saying basically that if you want to access the market in our country, you have to comply with our laws. So, famous example, I think it may have resolved, but for months and months and months, if you were in Russia, you couldn't access LinkedIn. And the reason for that is Russia has a law that says basically, if you want to access the Russian market, you have to store all the information on the Russians using your site here in Russia. And Google and Yahoo and these companies, caved on that, but LinkedIn did not, and said, no, we're not going to do that. And so Russia blocked them. China has just issued a new law that's very, very restrictive in the same way. And basically they want, all that information stored in China. And if you don't do it, they're going to block you out of China. So for companies like Google and Yahoo, it creates a conundrum. Not so much Yahoo anymore, but Twitter and what have you.
Sure.
And so you're seeing all of these things develop, and then you have the law. You have the internet itself advancing just technologically. The internet is always technologically about 5 to 10 years ahead of wherever the legal standards are being set. And so you have things like Internet of Devices, the Amazon Echo, and issues popping up with that. So, for instance, just recently, there was a murder case. A man called police, said, "Come to my house. My wife is dead. Somebody broke in and killed her, robbed us and killed her during a burglary." And they came in and they saw they had an Amazon Echo. And what a lot of people don't realize is that's recording you all of the time and uploading you, what you're saying. And they went back into the Amazon Echo recordings and found out that, in fact, what had happened was the couple had a fight and the man had killed his wife. And so they were able to get a murder conviction based on that. And so there are questions about, do you really want people recording everything you do? And Amazon's not at fault for that. I mean, every company's launching these devices, but Amazon does just launch a new one that's clothing oriented that will be in your bedroom, and it will basically take images of the outfits that you're using, and either make suggestions of, for the products that would fit within that, or you can send those outfits, those images out to your friends for their comments, which sounds great, except, do you really want somebody in your bedroom all the time?
Things are changing, and it's really a matter of privacy, right? How much privacy do we want to give up versus convenience and luxuries and all these different things, right?
It is. That is, one of the interesting things is there's actually a bit of a war going on right now between the European Union and the U.S., and it's over privacy, which, would be something you wouldn't really think. Privacy law in the United States is, to be quite frank, a joke. You really don't have any privacy here. The privacy issues that are debated based on the internet, 20 years ago, would have been looked at from a criminal aspect, and you would have this big uproar, over whether they were constitutional or not. But we've moved to a society now where sharing things is not only standard, but it can be a way of creating an income, whether you're on YouTube or Instagram or whatever. And so people don't really think about these things, and so there are serious questions about how far do we want to go. As far as the government's collecting information, they collect quite a bit. But private entities collect huge amounts of information. And just last night, I was talking with my father. We were talking about Google and Apple and how much money they've invested in the self-driving cars. And you think about that, that is an internet-connected device. Those cars will be connected to the cloud, and somebody will be able to tell where you are at any time, with you. We almost move into a brave new world. We've almost given away all of our rights without really thinking about it. Now, in other countries like Europe, that's the opposite. Europe considers privacy a constitutional right. In the United States, that's a much more dubious concept because there is no right of privacy written into the U.S. Constitution. And as anybody's probably tired of hearing about with the abortion cases in Roe v. Wade, they established a right of privacy. That was something that the judges established, and now we have a Supreme Court that is the majority is conservative, and will be for a good bit of time now, probably the next 20, 30 years at least. And so the question then becomes, will they overturn that, and then what happens to privacy in the U.S.? But anyways, in the EU, it is a constitutional right, and so what you're seeing is companies like Google and Facebook are having problems in the EU. In fact, Google was just fined $22 billion or something of that, no, $2.7 billion, something of that sort. Because their business model in the U.S. doesn't translate to a model in the EU where privacy protections exist. So in the EU, for instance, there's a new general data protection regulation going into effect in April 2018 that says you must get consent from people before you collect their information. Well, the Google and the Facebook business model in the U.S., consent is not required, and so they're just sweeping up huge amounts of data, and then they monetize that data for advertisers, and that's their biggest moneymaker. So how are they going to do that in the EU? The other issue that you have with the EU, in the US, for instance, you have something called the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And what it says is if you collect information online from minors under 13 years of age, you have to get parental verification first. And that's why if you've ever joined a forum or you've gone to Facebook or whatever, you always have to check a box when you register that says I'm 13 or older. That's what they're doing. They're trying to avoid that law because it's very onerous, obviously, to try to get parental verification. Well, with the new General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, they're going to have a similar provision. It's called Article 8, except they bumped the age up to under 16.
Oh, wow.
So so think about Facebook right now in the EU or the US. How many 14 and 15-year-olds do you think are on Facebook?
Tons, right? I got a question real quick, and then you can continue. How is it possible for an entity, a government, to shut down websites in their country? I thought the internet was just decentralized, and maybe you understand that better than I do.
They're not shutting down the website. They're just blocking it, so they can block the IP address. There are different ways to do it. Depends on what their infrastructure is set up to. So LinkedIn still exists. LinkedIn's fine. We can access it here, but you can block the data pipe basically coming into that country. When you get down to it, when you get into the infrastructure of the digital data transfer, what is essentially the internet, when you get into the core parts of it, the data pipes there's not millions of them. So depending on the country, there may only be 10 or 20 or maybe even fewer. So you have ability to regulate that. And there are other ways that you can also, not so much with LinkedIn, but you can also kill a business. So for instance, with gambling, online gambling, in other countries, gambling is an accepted act of business, and people can do it. It's not a big deal. Obviously, in the U.S., we have restrictions on it. And one of the problems they had when you had online poker, for instance, was how do you regulate that without violating trade agreements? And so what the U.S. did was we didn't outlaw online gambling, which is a misunderstood thing. A lot of people think poker was outlawed. It wasn't outlawed. What we did was we stuck a amendment onto what's called the Safe Harbor Act, which was an act to provide money to harbors to basically check for nuclear weapons and other nasty stuff coming into the harbors. And that act said that banks could not process the charges to poker sites and any other gambling sites, online casinos and what have you. And that's why it's difficult to play. So you see those kinds of acts where they'll just cripple an entire business industry. So technically you could still go play poker online. It's just very difficult to do it for money. So you have those kinds of access, and there are different techniques that they'll use. I'm not an infrastructure expert by any stretch of the imagination, but there are ways to block them.
Well, I mean, that's interesting to note. And I guess with so many of the changes that's happening with the internet, what will governments and authorities do to control it in the Wild West? Because the internet is still considered the Wild West in many aspects. I mean, look what's happening with money right now. Sure. It's a Wild West right now with cryptocurrencies and what's going on out there. And I know one of my previous guests described it as, sure, the government's handing out acres and acres of land in the middle of the U.S., but you can get shot by Indians right now. If you go out there, the opportunity is there, but also the risk is there as well. And so that's just an interesting way to think about the internet and what we're seeing right now. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, which is so important, is hacking. You brought this up in the pre-interview, hacking on the internet. How big of an issue is this, and what you're seeing, and are there ways to even prevent it and limit your exposure?
Right. Yes, it is a big issue. The fortunate part of hacking is the most profitable hacking is against large entities. I don't know if anybody's ever watched Mr. Robot, if the audience has ever seen it, but they go after E Corp, which is probably very similar to Goldman Sachs or something of that sort, and they call them Evil Corp. That's kind of what you see online is that the big hacks are are focused on entities. But the problem with hacking right now is it's moved from a situation where, you picture somebody in a dark lit room writing code, and doing nasty things, to a situation where it's no different than any other software service type of platform. So just as you can, log into WordPress and do a dashboard, and there's a preset system there for you to use, or you can log into Quicken to do your books or whatever. You can now just rent time on systems, on botnets. A botnet is a system where somebody's gone out and they've created malware that downloads little control modules onto computers, and the way they give it to you is they'll say, like, download this free song or download these free images or whatever it is. You download it and you don't realize that your computer now has this. And then when the person wants to activate the botnet, they can send out a code, and the botnets will start sending messages. They're used in denial of service attacks, for instance. Denial of service attack is when you have your website up, somebody gets angry at you, and what they do is they just flood your website with hits. And what happens is it overloads the server freezes, and nobody can access your site. And that can go on for a while. But even with the more difficult hacking devices, ransomware, we were talking about before the interview. Ransomware is a system where basically they get access to your computer, they get access to your files, and they encrypt them. And once they're encrypted, obviously you can't get into them. And we've seen this recently with hospitals and a whole variety of things. And once they're encrypted, particularly on the personal level, they're not going to ask you for 50, but they'll ask you for something like $300. You pay the $300, and then they unencrypt your files. And for a lot of people, they're just going to pay the $300. Well, if you think of that concept being replicated across, 10,000 people, it suddenly becomes a profitable business venture. And so I think you're going to see a lot of this because programs, the way that they're written, the security on programs is very difficult to put in place unless you're willing to spend just a ton of money. You're always going to have 0 days. 0 days are what you might call gaps in the security of a program that the company doesn't know about. And so if somebody finds one of those, they're very valuable. They can sell them to other hackers or other entities, criminal entities, what have you, because that allows a person to get into that system, record the files, record personal information of customers, whatever it may be. Zappos, was hit in 2012. Somebody got into their system, got access to the customers. Target was, the huge example a few years ago, where somebody got in there and they basically put a copy file on every transaction that happened. The transactions were they were all being sent out to a server in the Ukraine, I think, and it was just a disaster. So hacking is going to be an issue. I think if your listeners are just using the internet personally, I think that you have to be aware of ransomware and really think about some of the things you download, and be really careful. Honestly, there's just no way to avoid it if somebody's after you. But if you have critical data, that you're saving on your PC, get a external hard drive and save it to that hard drive every month or two or something of that sort, just so you don't get completely wiped out by somebody. Somebody freezes all your files and then wants 25 grand or something like that you don't have. Obviously that's a problem. So using an external hard drive is a good move. If you're a business, you just you have to update everything, keep all of your systems updated, and then you also have to again, save to some external source, so that if you do have something frozen, you're able to recover from that relatively quickly, without too many problems. The other aspect of hacking, which is kind of scary, is as we move to a more digital lifestyle, even things that you wouldn't traditionally think about, or things that you've heard about that probably sound Hollywoodish, actually come true. You can hack cars. There are videos online of guys hacking Jeeps, for instance. They're easy to hack. You can hack pacemakers. You can do all these things. So it's a situation that's not going to go away. And then, when you tie them into cryptocurrencies, and then the ability to pull money, out without it being tracked, or at least theoretically without it being tracked, you're in a kind of interesting environment where you have anonymity and you can do things and get away with it, quite frankly. So long as you're just not a big enough target, you don't annoy enough people,
right?
That the government's going to track you down. So that's kind of the situation you're in, and you even see it with governments. Governments are the U.S. went after Iran, their uranium enrichment program, and it was a system called the Olympic Games, which most people know as Stuxnet. Stuxnet was the name given to it after the private industries discovered it, but it was a virus, brilliant virus, and it's a long story, but basically they jumped the air gap in some way and got into the uranium enrichment facility, and they just destroyed a vast number of the enrichment devices. Problem was the code got out onto the internet. Most people think Israel was at fault, but they got out onto the internet, and now you can go pull up the Stuxnet code. You can see this incredible code, this incredible virus, and you can customize it, to do whatever you want. Obviously, you have to have certain expertise there. But in the last year, the Ukrainian power grid went down twice, and most people think it was the Russians experimenting with the code. So if you get to a situation where governments have a code where they can do that, it becomes very worrisome, because let's say somebody walks into a coffee shop in the U.S. with a USB, pops it in, and uploads this code, and fires off the attack. Not only do you have the attack, but you have no way to identify who was the source.
Wow.
So you could easily pit countries, large countries against each other. So that's, so then you start getting into, put the pillow over your head and stay in bed kind of scenarios.
yeah, really, how far can this go? I mean, I have to disconnect from the fact that the threat is out there, and we're carrying around phones which track everything we do. My phone's constantly asking me if I want to share. I'm at the Bass Pro Shop, and it's asking me if I want to tell 1,000 people that I'm at the Bass Pro Shop and write a review, and I have to numb myself to it, because it's unbelievable how much of our privacy is just completely out there. But let's get into 7 steps to protecting yourself when running a business online. You have expertise on this. Let's open this can of worms.
Okay. If you start a business online, you're thinking about doing it, obviously you want to do it in such a manner as to limit your risk. Anybody can go file a lawsuit, unfortunately, for a couple $100, but you can really position your business in such a way that you limit the risk of that happening, or if it does happen, of you actually getting a negative result. The first thing to start with would be choice of forum. You had actually already raised this issue. If your company's in Florida, you're shipping from Chicago, and the client is in Seattle, and there's a dispute, where's the lawsuit heard? Terms and conditions of your website or your app are a key document. Those terms and conditions are basically a contract with the customer, and you get to write the terms. So as long as they're not too one-sided, you can include clauses that will basically help you either eliminate the lawsuit or, again, limit the ultimate result. A choice of forum clause would be one of the clauses, and what that clause says is if there's a legal dispute between us, it will be heard in this county. And then obviously you pick your county. And courts will uphold this clause probably about 75% of the time. They look at whether it's fair or not. So if we look at our customer in Seattle, if our customer in Seattle is a physician, a well-paid physician, they're going to uphold that because it's not really a burden on him. If our customer in Seattle is, a 75-year-old disabled woman who's retired and living on Social Security disability, they're probably not going to enforce it. But it is an effective tool. And you see groups like Google. Google just had lawsuits moved out of New York to California, which are more favorable. That's where California, Google's located. And that's a clause that you want to have. Your terms and conditions are really important for another reason. As I mentioned earlier, we now have this conservative Supreme Court. They made a major change to the law. It's a technical legal issue that can bore a lot of people, but what you need to know is in 2011, in a case called AT&T Mobility versus Concepcion, the Supreme Court said that the issue of whether companies could require consumers to go to arbitration instead of a trial was controlled by federal law. Previously, it had been interpreted as being controlled by state law. And they said under the Federal Arbitration Act of 1925 that businesses could, in fact, require customers to do that. So in your terms and conditions, you always want an arbitration clause, and you want what's called a class action waiver clause. The reason you want those two clauses is businesses tend to get a better break in arbitration. Arbitrations are heard by retired judges or attorneys, not juries. and juries can be emotionally inflamed. If you think about the famous McDonald's hot coffee case where they awarded millions of dollars to the woman who was burned by a hot coffee she had ordered. She actually had a case. It wasn't just a hot coffee. It was just blistering hot coffee. But, I'm not sure she should have gotten millions and millions of dollars. If that had been an arbitration, she probably would have won and, received her medical fees and then some amount for pain and suffering, maybe $100,000. So putting those kinds of clauses into your terms is also very important. The other thing is that if you sell or you rent, or not rent, you sell or you register a customer, the customer is required to take any kind of action. You have to have them check a box that says, yes, I agree to the terms and conditions and privacy policy. If you have Apple products or any kind of online products, but Apple in particular, they're always asking you to check the box and agree to their new terms or their modified terms. The reason they're doing that is courts now require that. They're only going to bind your customers to your legal documents on your site if the customer basically says that they've read them, and that's what they're doing when they check that box. If you don't have the check the box, the court will not bind them. And the reason for that is in 2000 and 2001, judges could barely work their own email. 16 years later, they're fully familiar with web. They use it every day, and they realize nobody scrolls to the bottom of a website and clicks the terms and conditions link. I mean, just nobody does. Mm-hmm. So that's a requirement there. Another one that you want to look at is in your privacy policy. There are free privacy policies out there which are horrible, and templates and things floating around that are just nasty. And they all include a phrase that says something along the lines of, "We will not sell, share, or rent your information." And it sounds like a noble statement. You're trying to protect your customers and tell them they're not going to get hit with advertising and everything. The problem is, if you ever want to sell your website, one of the most valuable aspects of it is your customer list or your email list. And you just prohibited yourself from selling it. And courts have actually looked into that. There was a True.com case with True.com as a dating site, and their parent company had problems, went into bankruptcy. And a dating site called Plenty of Fish was trying to purchase their database of members. And they were going to pay $700,000 for it, and the court struck down the agreement. And that was, again, because True.com had included something in their privacy policy along the lines of, "We will not sell, share, or rent your information." And so you have to be a little careful with those statements that otherwise seem, like they would be normal and things you would want included there. Definitely, you want to be careful with. And then the DMCA copyright. Copyright is probably the biggest issue you run into online with your website. When you get pictures, anything of that sort, you need to license them. You need to have a justified source for those images. You can't just go onto Google or onto a website and copy and publish another image. Including a link back to that site does not excuse copyright infringement. It's attribution. It's called attribution. Attribution, not only does it not excuse copyright infringement, it actually hurts you when you put that link, because you're essentially saying to the court, "Yeah, I know I took it." It's not an innocent act where, "Oh, I didn't know what copyright law was. I know what copyright law is. I'm just taking it anyways." So courts on that. So, license your content, or far better, take original content. Everybody has a phone now. Original content's definitely the way to go. But if you have a website where you're going to allow people to upload stuff, the DMCA is the way to go. And DMCA registration costs $6. You have to file an agent with Copyright Office. You can use a service like DMCAagentservice.com. I don't own the site. So, and basically, once you go through the compliance process, what the DMCA says is that as a website, you are not responsible for copyright infringement claims based on the content uploaded by your users. So if you think again about YouTube, somebody uploads a video and they have a Rolling Stones song playing on that video, YouTube is not liable for that. Now the person that uploaded it is, but YouTube is not. And so that prevents just a tsunami of copyright infringement lawsuits. So if you have a website where you allow people to upload photos or music or videos or anything, get in compliance with the DMCA, it will save your life. And finally, finishing on somewhat of a boring topic, buy insurance. I can't tell you how many internet businesses I run to that don't have insurance. Buy a liability insurance policy. And there are two reasons. One, if you get sued, you're going to need to hire an attorney to defend you. Attorneys are expensive. Your insurance policy will pay for that attorney.
Okay.
So even if the claim is nuts, it can cost you $5 or $10 just to get rid of it, and your policy will pay for that. And then second, obviously, the policy will pay any penalty, any settlement or any judgment that's required in case you did make a mistake. So take that step, and you definitely live so much easier if you have a legal dispute, because you'll be able to sleep at night and not worry about losing your car and anything else.
Wow. Wow, really so much to think about. And just as you talk, I get overwhelmed with everything that's out there, and just how much needs to be controlled, because there's just so much going on and so many moving parts, and the hacking and privacy.
Well, there is.
It's just, man.
There is. If you don't mind, let me say something about that. These legal issues that you face, particularly from the business side, the 7 steps that we went through. Yes, they can be scary, but they're actually just a to-do checklist, just like anything technical with your business. Just get a lawyer in your state who understands the issues, and they'll take care of them. It's not; these are just things you can work through. They're not a reason not to start a business. With as a lawyer, whenever you talk, you're always worried that you're going to create this massive fear for people, and they won't take steps they otherwise should. On the personal front with the hacking and everything else, yeah, it is worrisome. But again, just get an external hard drive and back up your stuff every couple of weeks. It's really simple to do. And then if you do have a problem with ransomware or something of that sort, you can always just, basically re-upload your operating system and off you go. So as bad as they sound, there are ways around them.
Ways to protect yourself. Well,
Sure.
Hey, Richard, great advice, and I appreciate your insight in this. I mean, you obviously have a lot of experience in this, and it's very insightful and great tips for everyone and anyone who's listening to this, whether you have a business or not. I'm sure it opened up people's minds as to things to think about as things are changing so rapidly in front of us. So if people want to learn more about what you're doing, what you're offering, please let everyone know where they'll go and what they'll find.
Sure. You can always find me at my law firm site, which is SoCal, like Southern California, SoCalInternetLawyer.com. There's blog articles on there talking about a number of these things. I also have a site, DMCA Agent Service, which supplies agents for companies that are looking to comply with the DMCA. One of the little negatives of the DMCA is that your information is listed publicly in an online database by the Copyright Office. So if you're working from home and you have kids or something of that sort, maybe you don't want some of your quote-unquote fans showing up at your front door. Using a third-party agent could be a smart move. But either of those sites, contact me, mention this podcast, and I'll be happy to give you a free consultation.
Good deal. All right, sir. Well, thanks for coming on the show. Appreciate your time.